Meine Jenseitserfahrung
My experience of the hereafter was an experience of consciousness. And therefore, I eventually concluded that the hereafter and our consciousness are connected in one form or another. The hereafter is a form of consciousness in which we eventually rediscover ourselves again.
Mr. Moissl, you had a near-death experience in your mid-30s. According to your description, it was an experience of remarkable beauty and extraordinary depth. Would you start by telling us which circumstances led to this experience and what you experienced at the time?
Ja, es war eine sehr seltsame Situation eigentlich.
Well, actually, it was a very strange situation. It is often assumed that near-death experiences just go hand in hand with clinical death, but this wasn't the case with me.
Ganz normal bei mir zu Hause.
It happened in a normal setting, namely in my home.
Und da stellte
At the time, I was still married and we had a house.
musste dann heraus.
And all of a sudden, the door rang in the early morning. We had actually some days off, so I had to get up and open the door, and I didn't expect that two complete strangers would stand in front of the door.
Welche Wasseruhren ablesen und ich
The two men came from the waterworks or the power station, something along those lines, and they wanted to read from the water meter. And I hadn't expected this, and thus my circulatory system wasn't quite all there yet. So I led them to the cellar where the water meter was.
der Kreislauf langsam versagt.
While showing them around in the cellar, I realized that my circulatory system was about to go. And so I tried to flee upstairs to our dining room, and I was just thinking that I should sit down somewhere and elevate my legs,
Ja, diese
and that I would somehow fix this poor circulation which had come over me.
wieder in Ordnung bringe. Habe ich aber nicht
However, I didn't make it, and I just fell over next to the dining table,
umgekippt.
and I was lying on the floor,
Und
and the next thing that happened was just fascinating and outstanding.
für mich und so außergewöhnlich.
At first, I didn't quite understand it, but I saw myself lying on the floor in our dining room.
Erde liegen in unserem Esszimmer und habe dann
Strangely, the situation felt quite normal after a short period of time.
völlig normal empfunden. Also es war
In other words, it wasn't like I was shocked or something along those lines.
irgendwas Außergewöhnliches, sondern ja,
I just accepted it and de facto started looking around our dining and living room. I could see a strange and grey environment.
But in principle, you saw your familiar surroundings.
Yes, in principle I did see my familiar surroundings, but it was like more in a diffused manner. And I was thinking, what should I do now? And then it occurred to me to leave the house. I wanted to go outside.
durch diese Wand gehe ich jetzt.
I then saw the wall of our dining room and thought, let's go through this wall and let's take a look around outside.
Es war tatsächlich so.
It might sound very irrelevant, but that is what actually happened.
Ohne weiteres durchdringen können.
But then I hesitated. It was pretty clear to me that I'd be able to penetrate this wall without any difficulties.
Wand heraus.
It wouldn't have been an issue at all. However, I hesitated somehow, and suddenly something came out of this wall. The wall changed somehow. It also took on a light-like, milky, foggy shape. And out of this bright white light, a light being came towards me. And that was actually the bottom line.
Was ich da erlebt habe, das war so
I-
außergewöhnlich.
What I experienced was so remarkable and fascinating.
Denn das wesentlichste Gefühl, was mir dieses Lichtwesen mitgab, war eine unglaubliche Form von Liebe.
Because the core feeling that this being shared with me was the incredible form of love,
Heißt,
forgiveness and atonement.
zu beschreiben, es fällt
Well, I always try to describe it like that.
in diesem Moment von einem ab.
All the burdens of life fell off, and it was such a liberating feeling. No human being can imagine that.
Und
And I don't want to talk about it for too long, but it happened to be that this light being started speaking to me.
auch ansprach.
and it called me by my first name and said,
ansprach und meinte,
"If you want,
willst, dann hast du
you can call it a day." This was an invitation for me to come with it, potentially to the hereafter.
eventuell in dieses Jenseits. Und
And it was clear to me that if I decided to penetrate this wall from which that light being had come from and had appeared in front of me, and if I decided to go to the other side, I would leave this world and my body completely and forever,
würde und auf die andere Seite,
and that I would go to the hereafter.
ja, dann würde ich damit diese Welt und meinen Körper komplett und für immer verlassen und würde ins Jenseits eingehen.
However, it didn't come to that.
Doch nicht.
Of course not, because otherwise I wouldn't have been here today.
Und
And somehow my mind, my soul, or my consciousness might have decided against it.
mein Bewusstsein
And maybe one of them said, "No, I'm going to stay here, and maybe I still need to fulfill a few tasks." But the main factor was that I could, or was allowed to decide freely, whether I wanted to stay in this world or whether I wanted to leave it. And the deciding factor was also this incredible feeling of contentment, this bliss that was passing through me at that moment.
Light being, what should we understand by this? Was this light being in the shape of a human? Would you be able to describe this in more detail?
ja, obwohl es schwierig ist, aber es
Yes, although it is quite hard.
hatte, ich sag mal,
I'd say this being had a bodily frame.
ist als ob
It was like the shape of a silhouette and body of a slender, tall human being that was standing in front of me.
menschlichen Wesens, eines sehr schlanken, hochgewachsenen menschlichen Wesens vor mir stünde. Allerdings
However, it just consisted of light. It wasn't dressed somehow, but it practically just consisted of light. But it was hazy.
bestand
It was the idea of a human image. That's how I'd like to describe it. It's very hard to express. Essentially, there was something like a mental and spiritual connection between the being and me. So the pictorial presentation wasn't so relevant anymore. But well in my consciousness, something like a human frame manifested itself. I think that to a certain extent, the images that we take with us from our humanly life into the hereafter play a role as well.
werden auch eine gewisse Rolle spielen.
In retrospect, I didn't have any religious connection or anything along those lines.
Keinen religiösen Bezug,
Meaning, I didn't really draw a connection to a Christian belief system,
wo das mit meinem
but instead, it was a situation completely secluded from a religious or ecclesiastical background.
von religiösem Hintergrund, von kirchlichem Hintergrund
There, it didn't matter anymore.
Rolle mehr.
And only in retrospect, I try to process these things and think about them again.
Zu verarbeiten und da nochmal drüber nachzudenken.
I felt it was a divine grace that allowed me to see this part or area, or practically invited me to it. But I didn't connect this experience with religions or worldly religions. This just was not the case.
When you think of the love that you felt, did you get the impression that this love came from the light being, or that it was connected to this light being?
Ja,
Well, yes, it was really like that. When the light being appeared, this deciding factor happened.
diese
At that moment, I felt this bliss and that all the burdens of human life fell off.
dieses Abfallen der menschlichen Lebenslast, sage ich mal, dieses Freisein, dieses komplette
This feeling of freedom and being set free from everything.
alles,
At that moment, actually everything became irrelevant.
man auf dieser Welt
I was free from all those mental burdens that you carry around in the world, that you take with you.
sich führt. Und,
And that was the beauty of it and the liberation.
aber wie gesagt, es ist tatsächlich so, dass
But as mentioned before, it wasn't like there was a religious background connected to this experience.
nicht so
Meaning, it wasn't as if I could or as if I had to take on an ecclesiastical, Christian, or any other religious standpoint.
hätte einnehmen können oder müssen.
It was completely detached from these things.
You mentioned that quite quickly you viewed this out-of-body state as something natural.
Selbstverständliches betrachtet haben.
At this moment, was it normal for you to see life in a bigger overall context?
Gesamtzusammenhang
That you were connected to a bigger being that you had already always known?
haben.
Did you have such perceptions as well?
Ja,
Yes, these did exist as well. Actually, I was a bit irritated at the beginning, but this irritation disappeared relatively quickly. I perceived the situation as something relatively normal rather quickly. And I also thought about my next possible actions quite normally, and what I should do with this situation, what I should do now. And thus I looked around our room accordingly, while the things that had been visually in front of me, such as my body, etc., all those things moved further and further away. They practically drifted away and became smaller, more unreal and more irrelevant, and therefore I more or less let myself be guided by the situation. As mentioned before, I experienced the situation with the light being, and from that point on, everything went on a course I couldn't or didn't want to influence anymore. That's the way it was. Well, I don't know how to express this in any other way. It was beautiful. It was impressive. There was such an overflow of emotions and feelings in me that everything else became irrelevant and secondary all of a sudden. I didn't think about these things anymore. I'm struggling for words. It doesn't work when you try to put such moments into words and images. We can only use images that we're familiar with in this world, and these images practically don't do this any justice. And therefore, I have to leave many things open and can't express things the way I'd like to express them. I tried to do that when I was writing my book, though. I described this near-death experience over several pages and almost failed when I was in the process of writing this one chapter. I discarded, rewrote, and reformulated it several times. You don't know how much I struggled to put this in words because I didn't want to misrepresent this topic, or I almost want to say desecrate this topic. Because to me, it was a holy situation. That's actually how I'd like to describe it. I wanted to represent this in a form that would take account of this spiritual event. And this was very difficult.
How did you cope with your experiences later on? Were you aware that you had a near-death experience right from the beginning? Were you able to speak to others about it?
This is a very good question. Actually, I ran into a lot of difficulties. Firstly, I didn't really interpret it as a near-death experience because I hadn't really dealt with the topic of near-death experience before. I just heard about it in passing, that something like this does exist. But I couldn't really categorize it at first. For me, it was just a wonderful experience, and at first it wasn't really important to me to define it according to human and scientific parameters. However, I started dealing with this topic in more detail and eventually thought, well, you just had a circulatory collapse. That's what the doctor had diagnosed. Well, could this really have been a near-death experience? In order to have that, don't you have to be clinically dead and be in hospital? How would I know reanimation and all the other shebang? However, I started reading more about the subject and quickly realized that in fact I'd had a near-death experience. You don't have to be dead in order to have a near-death experience. This was the first question, and the second was, how did I cope with it in front of the people around me? I carefully, so to speak, tried to open up to the people who were close to me and confide in them. But I'd never experienced that much lack of understanding and rejection as during that period of time. I had the feeling that people viewed me as a mentally ill person based on the motto, now he's completely losing it. I'd probably always been somebody who didn't react to things quite normally, and I always used to go my own way.
A nonconformist.
Yes, a nonconformist. I think that's what you could call it. And thus, I quickly stopped such conversations and gave up on them. And so for a while, I kept this topic close to my chest.
What happened after you had decided to go back into your body?
zurückzukehren.
Were there gaps in your memory, or was it overall a cohesive memory without interruptions?
Ohne Unterbrechung.
Well, no, there was no mental gap of my memory. The transition from this world to the hereafter happened in a way that I had a mental blackout. Everything became dark. It turned black in front of my eyes. It was as if I was sitting in a hollow bell made of clay, and suddenly I was in the hereafter, and as quickly I was in the hereafter, I came back. When this light being gave me the alternative, it happened from one second to the other that I found myself in my own body again. And then there were those two gentlemen who had come to read the water meter, leaning over me. They'd been looking for me, found me lying there, looked after me, called for my wife, and so on and so forth. And well, then they shook me until I woke up and regained my consciousness. And all of a sudden, I was back again.
And you were able to remember all the things that you just told me immediately after waking up?
Yes, I could see it so vividly in front of me. And it was so impressive and powerful. It's hard to imagine the intensity of this experience. Until today, and it's been 30, yes, it happened 30 years ago, this experience has had a continuing effect on me until now.
What effect has this experience had on you? In how far has the near-death experience had a lasting effect on your way of thinking and your decision-making in everyday life?
Ja, das war schon ein tiefer Einschnitt tatsächlich in mein Denken, Fühlen und Handeln.
Well, yes. It actually was a dramatic break in my way of thinking, and it also influenced the way I felt and acted. One of the first things that became clear was the fact that many things that I'd only been allowed to believe from my Christian and religious background were confirmed. In other words, the idea that there is a hereafter, that there is a divine love, that other dimensions do exist, and they welcome us when we leave this world. And this had been one of my religious fundamental convictions even before this event had happened. But after this experience, it turned into certainty, and this is something that is very hard to process if something you just believed in becomes a fact. This was one aspect, but additionally, I dealt with the topic more and also read more about religion. And I tried to reflect on near-death experiences more and more, and try to connect them with experiences in this world. And this led to, after a long period of time, this is something I should mention here, I decided to write a book about it. However, it wasn't a book just about near-death experiences, but I wanted to study these things from a philosophical and religious angle, and I tried to question religious and philosophical issues due to my near-death experience. And this was a very moving and very interesting process.
If I may say so, your book is a very impressive outcome of your efforts to connect your near-death experience to a more wide-ranging ideological background. If we talk about the keyword philosophy, what is your resume? Which philosophers and which philosophical ideas have impressed you the most?
Die Philosophie ist ja nun ein sehr, sehr weiterreichendes Feld.
Well, philosophy is a wide-ranging field, and we can agree with various opinions, whether it is nihilism by Nietzsche or atheism by Feuerbach. And at first, it was quite hard to choose which direction I wanted to take. However, this near-death experience equipped me with a certain background and enticed me to look specifically for philosophers that dealt with this field, and thus I mainly found Plato, who'd already written papers about this topic in 300 to 400 BC. And that was extremely interesting for me. Also, his works were compatible with my experiences, so this philosopher grabbed my attention. So I read Plato's works very intensely, and after that I also moved on to his successors, the Neoplatonists, and then I realized that many things that I'd experienced during my near-death experience and the spiritual knowledge that I'd gained, I realized that these things had already been identified and written down, and this was extremely fascinating for me.
The title of your book is called Hereafter and Consciousness.
Und Bewusstsein.
These are both very controversial terms that are not agreed on in our materialistic and naturalistic sciences.
Naturwissenschaft.
What do these terms mean to you? Do you see a connection between consciousness and the hereafter?
Bewusstsein und Jenseits.
Ja, das ist ein ganz, ganz wichtiger Punkt, den anzusprechen. Denn,
Yes, it is an important point to address because drawing a connection between these two is also the essence of my book.
es ist ja so, dass die
Look at science, it claims that consciousness stems from our material existence, from our brain. We wouldn't have a consciousness if we didn't exist as physical humans.
in unserem Gehirn wir
However, for me, it's the other way around.
leibliche Menschen.
For me, consciousness is the deciding factor.
Andersherum da.
We are by nature a spiritual being and not a material being, and everything can be created by consciousness. And thus, I finally came to the conclusion that the hereafter and our consciousness are connected somehow.
Zusammenhang. Und
There is a causal connection, and as I was thinking about it, and also because of my philosophical views, I came to the conclusion that consciousness and the hereafter are about the same. As soon as we are in the hereafter, we are just consciousness. We are only spiritual beings. We are completely dematerialized.
völlig entmaterialisiert. Wir sind
We are not a physical being anymore. We are just pure being.
Wesenheit. Und von daher
And from there, I can see a direct connection with what we call the hereafter.
das Jenseits ist eine
The hereafter is a form of consciousness in which we eventually rediscover ourselves again.
uns wiederfinden, wenn wir die
When we leave behind the material, I'd also like to call it the virtual world, the world that we experience here. When we leave behind this world, then we rediscover ourselves again in the consciousness of the hereafter.
Questions regarding the hereafter are usually attributed to the area of religion. That's entering dangerous ground. Religion gives many people hold in life. From another point of view, religion can also be viewed as a prison. How do you perceive religion? Should religion have a special significance in the life of a person?
Also zunächst mal halte ich Religion für ein schon sehr wertvolles Gut, das wir hier auf dieser Welt haben.
Well, first of all, I view religion as a valuable good in this world, because religion eventually inspired me to choose a spiritual path that helped me to take a path which showed me that this world isn't everything and final.
Dass die Welt hier nicht alles und das Letztendgültige ist.
However, we must or should also deal with religions carefully because they oftentimes claim a certain exclusive right in this world.
Vorsichtig umgehen, denn Religionen neigen leider Gottes eben auch dazu, ein gewisses Exklusivrecht für sich in dieser Welt zu fordern. Und dieses Exklusivrecht der Religionen,
And as someone who has had a near-death experience, I can't really understand this exclusive right in any way.
auch da
That's why I did my own research, because I thought there must be intersections between religions, intersections that connect religions.
geben, die
But of course, there are also dividing factors.
und es gibt aber auch Trennendes.
A lot of dividing factors. If you deal with Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, and so on, you will find many dogmas that eventually reinforce this claim of exclusivity of religions.
Sind da
And I think at that point, we enter dangerous ground. We experience again and again how religious extremism, I would almost call it, leads to dead ends that don't get us anywhere as humans. It is for this reason why I try to work out the common features of different religions, and I actually found a lot of them.
miteinander verbinden.
Just to mention a few, for example, the belief in the hereafter, the belief in a life after death, the belief in a divine instance. These are things which connect many religions, and they are also the deciding factor. The situation in the hereafter also presented itself to me as that these things are actually the deciding factor. The awareness that there is a hereafter. The awareness that we are a spiritual being. We live on forever. We are humans and beings that are ultimately not bound to this material world. And another important factor is this connectivity to a divine instance, to a divine love. And that is the point where all religions meet again. Here, they are true. Here, they help people. But where religions exclude each other, they sometimes become grotesque and also absurd, sadly. And this is the factor I always wanted to resist.
The biggest secret of being a human is probably our conscious inner world. Generally speaking, humans are just considered to be a material being, and consciousness is a side product of brain functions. From your perspective, what is the essential core of humans? What is your conception of man?
Ja, nicht so ohne weiteres und nicht so einfach zu beantworten. Da wird es jetzt wirklich schon schwierig, das so.
Well, this can't be answered that easily. Here, it's getting quite tricky to present this without further ado. But if I try to make it clear that we are a spiritual, otherworldly being, if we try to blank out this material world for a moment, then I think we'll get to the true nature of our existence the closest.
Dann denke ich, kommen wir dem wahren Wesen unseres Daseins am nächsten.
When we understand that we are a pure spirit, when we understand that we are a consciousness, a being, a soul,
Wesenheit, Seele, wenn wir verstehen,
when we understand that the world we experience here is more of a virtual world that was created by all of our spirits
Geist entstanden ist,
and eventually through a divine spirit.
der
Plato described it as a primal force of a being that created all of this. I think here we'll get to the nature of humans relatively close, and here I need to emphasize the word relatively, because we won't fathom the true nature of humans that easily. We're actually quite far from it. I don't think we're meant to dig too deeply into this nature of humans because it might drive us crazy.
würde uns das wahrscheinlich auch wahnsinnig machen.
We might encounter views that might not be helpful in this world. That's how I'd like to describe it.
Wir müssen uns schon klar machen,
That's what we have to make clear to ourselves. We live in a material world here, and we have to deal with this world.
ich denke, gewisse Aufgaben hier zu erfüllen sind.
I think we are here to fulfill certain tasks, and we are here for a certain reason.
Es ist so, dass dieses Leben so eine Art Schule ist.
I always say, at least that's the case for me, that life is a kind of school during which we educate ourselves spiritually further, to develop our consciousness even further, and to shape and expand our being more in order to get a step ahead in our mental and spiritual presence.
Und in unserer Seele
But also to get a step ahead in our form of existence. That's how I'd carefully describe it.
ist mal vorsichtig.
Due to your many years of experience and findings,
vielen Jahren
is there something that seems important to you, something that you would like to pass on to other people?
Ja, da gibt es einen ganz wesentlichen Punkt.
Yes, there is a very significant aspect I would like to mention.
In Religionen hat mir gezeigt, dass
Dealing with different religions showed me that on the one hand, there is a lot of good and truth that can be found in religions.
einiges korrigiert werden müsste und
On the other hand, there is still quite a bit that needs to be corrected, and it's still the case that there are many conflicts between religions.
als Vermittler, ich möchte
And I would view myself as a mediator.
zwischen den Religionen
I would like to mediate between these different cultures and religions somehow.
einen Mittelweg aufzeigen, der die
I would like to illustrate a middle ground that leads people more towards an international understanding and peace, and to give love on earth more of a chance than it has been the case before.
als das bisher der Fall gewesen ist. Ich denke,
I think if this message from the hereafter can be transported to this world, it would already be a bit of a success.
das ist schon sehr, sehr viel. Und
I would be very happy if I could contribute something to a positive development.
Mr. Moissl, thank you very much for your openness and that you shared your experiences and findings with us. Thank you for this great interview.
I'd like to thank you.